In 2017, in a farming village in northeastern Madagascar, a mob dragged a man out of his house in the middle of the night, accused him of stealing beans from a neighbor's vine, and beat him to death in the street before the sun came up. He was not the only one. During that same stretch of years, vigilante killings over the same crop happened at a rate of roughly 5 a week across the vanilla-growing region of Madagascar. Villagers were sleeping in their fields with machetes to guard plants that were, gram for gram, worth more than silver. The crop was vanilla. Yes, that vanilla, the flavor so plain that we use its name as a synonym for boring. For a few terrifying years in the 2010s, the blandest word in the English language was also one of the most dangerous things you could be caught holding in rural Madagascar. So how did a flavor best known for being unremarkable end up fueling a wave of violence, a 4-century international monopoly, and a chemistry breakthrough built from tree bark and paper mill sludge? The story does not start in a factory or a French kitchen. It starts in the rainforests of eastern Mexico with a vine that should not, by any reasonable botanical logic, produce anything edible at all. Long before any European set foot in the Americas, the Totonac people of what is now the state of Veracruz, in the humid lowlands around the town of Papantla, were cultivating a wild climbing orchid that grew wrapped around tree trunks in the jungle canopy. They called it zanat. The plant, which botanists today classify as Vanilla planifolia, produced long, thin green pods that, left alone on the vine and simply picked, were flavorless and dry. But the Totonac had discovered something the rest of the world would spend centuries trying to reverse engineer. If you picked those pods at just the right moment, then cured them through weeks of sweating, drying, and conditioning in the sun, enzymes locked inside the pod's own cells broke down and produced a rich, dark, intensely fragrant compound unlike anything else in nature. Vanilla, in other words, was not discovered so much as it was invented, engineered by patient hands repeating a curing process across generations until a nearly tasteless bean bloomed into one of the most recognizable flavors on the planet. The Totonac used cured vanilla in religious offerings connected to fertility and abundance, and the plant became woven directly into their mythology. One story, still told in the region today, describes a princess named Zakopontsiza, devoted from birth to the service of a goddess, and forbidden from taking a husband, who fell in love with a young nobleman anyway. When the two ran off together into the forest, they were caught and put to death for defying that vow. According to the legend, from the exact spot where their blood soaked into the ground, a small green vine sprouted almost overnight, climbing up through the underbrush and producing slender pods that filled the surrounding jungle with a fragrance nobody had ever smelled before. The Totonac called the flower Zanath, the hidden one, and treated the plant it produced as something closer to a relic than a crop. Then, sometime in the 1400s, the Aztec Empire expanded into Totonac territory and did what expanding empires tend to do. It conquered the region and demanded tribute. Vanilla pods, which the Aztecs called Tlilxochitl, meaning roughly black flour, became one of the goods flowing north into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan alongside cacao. Aztec nobility mixed ground vanilla into their chocolate drinks, and the Emperor Montezuma himself was said to favor his cacao spiced with it. For the Totonac, a sacred plant had become a tax payment. For the Aztecs, it had become a luxury flavoring reserved for the ruling class. Then, in 1519, Hernán Cortés and his soldiers arrived on the coast of Mexico, and within 2 years the Aztec Empire had collapsed under Spanish conquest. The Spanish encountered the vanilla and cacao drink at the Aztec court, and unlike some of the other foods they dismissed outright, this one traveled well. Vanilla pods made their way back across the Atlantic to Spain sometime in the 1520s, almost always packed alongside cacao beans, because for the first 2 centuries of its life in Europe, vanilla barely existed as its own product. It was chocolate's sidekick. The very word we use today gives away how the Spanish first saw it. They called the pod vainilla, a diminutive of the Spanish word vaina, meaning sheath or little pod, the same root that gives us the word vagina in Latin, used clinically to describe a sheath-shaped case. To Spanish colonists, it was not a spice worth naming on its own. It was just a funny little seed pod. Apothecaries and wealthy households across Europe used it as a flavoring for chocolate, and, like most imported exotic goods of the era, occasionally prescribed it as medicine for stomach trouble and sluggish digestion. For close to 300 years after Cortés, Mexico held something almost no other country in the spice trade ever managed: an accidental, unbroken monopoly, not because Spain guarded the plant the way the Dutch guarded nutmeg or the Portuguese guarded cinnamon, but because nobody else on Earth could figure out how to make the plant reproduce outside its home soil. Papantla and the surrounding Totonac region remained the only meaningful source of cured vanilla sold anywhere in the world clear through the 1700s and into the 1800s, even as European colonial empires were actively trying to plant it everywhere from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. And this is where the story should have followed the same pattern as coffee, tea, and sugar, other tropical regions eventually growing the same plant and breaking the original monopoly. Except vanilla refused to cooperate. European planters in the 1700s and early 1800s took vanilla cuttings to their tropical colonies all over the world: Réunion and Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar, Java, in the Dutch East Indies. And in every single one of these places, something strange happened. The vines grew beautifully. The vines flowered right on schedule. And then, almost without exception, no pods ever formed. Colonial botanists were baffled. They had the right plant, the right climate, the right soil. What they did not have, and would not properly understand for decades, was the plant's original pollination partner. Back in Mexico, the vanilla orchid's flower has an unusual internal structure. Its male and female reproductive parts are separated by a thin membrane, and the flower is only open and receptive for a single day each year. In its native habitat, that obstacle is overcome by a specific native stingless bee, and possibly certain hummingbirds, built exactly right to reach past that membrane. Nowhere else on Earth did that insect exist. In 1836, a Belgian botanist named Charles Morin finally worked out why, traveling to Mexico, he identified the native Melipona bee as the plant's missing partner, and the following year published one of the first proposed methods for pollinating vanilla by hand. But Morin's technique was slow, fiddly, and financially useless at plantation scale. Nobody could figure out how to do it fast enough, cheaply enough, across enough flowers to matter. Europe had exported the orchid, but left its one working partner behind. And for roughly 3 centuries after vanilla left Mexico, nobody outside that one region could get it to reproduce in any way that made commercial sense. The person who finally cracked it was not a professor with a laboratory. He was an enslaved 12-year-old boy. His name was Edmond Albius, and he was born in 1829 on the French colony then known as Bourbon Island, in the Indian Ocean, which we now call Réunion. Orphaned early in his life, Edmond was enslaved on the plantation of a man named Ferréol Bellier Beaumont, an amateur botanist who took an interest in the boy and taught him about grafting and plant cultivation. In 1841, at just 12 years old, Edmond worked out how to pollinate vanilla flowers by hand, using nothing more sophisticated than a thin sliver of grass or a small stick to lift the membrane separating the flower's male and female parts and press them together himself, mimicking in a few seconds of deft motion what an entire generation of European botanists, Charles Morin included, had failed to turn into a workable method. It worked. It was fast, and crucially, It was cheap enough that a single field worker could pollinate hundreds of flowers in a single morning. Word of the technique spread across Réunion within a few years, then to Mauritius, and eventually across to Madagascar and the Comoros. For the first time since the plant had left Mexico, vanilla could be grown commercially anywhere in the world with the right tropical climate, provided someone was willing to touch every single flower by hand on the one day each year it opened. Back in Mexico, the country that had quietly held the world's only working vanilla supply for 3 centuries watched its advantage evaporate almost overnight. Papantla's growers could not compete with plantations that were suddenly popping up across the Indian Ocean, and by the end of the 1800s, Mexico's share of global vanilla production had collapsed from effectively 100% to a shrinking fraction, a decline that pushed many Totonac vanilla farming communities, the very people who had invented the crop in the first place, into poverty. The plant born in their jungles had, within a couple of generations, become someone else's export commodity. That last detail is the part most people miss, and it explains almost everything about vanilla's price tag today. Nearly 200 years later, there is still no reliable mechanical substitute for Edmond's technique. Every vanilla flower on every commercial farm on Earth, from Madagascar to Mexico to French Polynesia, is pollinated by a human hand using some version of the method a preteen orphan worked out in a matter of weeks. That single fact is why vanilla, alongside saffron, remains one of the 2 most expensive spices in the world by weight. Not because the plant itself is rare, but because turning it into a marketable crop still requires direct human labor performed at the exact right hour, flower by flower, across entire hillsides, every single year, followed by weeks of careful curing using essentially the same sweating and drying process the Totonac perfected centuries earlier. And here is the part of the story that should make you angry. Edmond Albius never profited from any of it. France abolished slavery in its colonies in 1848, and Edmond was freed as a young man, but the technique that was, by then, making plantation owners across the Indian Ocean enormously wealthy earned him nothing. Historical accounts describe him later working as a low-paid kitchen servant, and at one point he was accused of theft and briefly imprisoned. He died in poverty in 1880, largely unrecognized in his own lifetime, while the vanilla industry he had personally made possible was turning Réunion into the wealthiest vanilla-producing region on the planet. Réunion vanilla, still sometimes marketed today as bourbon vanilla, after the island's old colonial name, became the gold standard of the flavor world. The boy who made that entire industry possible did not live to see any of the money, and it would be more than a century before his name started appearing in the history books alongside it. Réunion held its position as the world's top vanilla producer for decades, but the crown eventually passed to a much larger island a few hundred miles away. French colonial administrators pushed vanilla cultivation into Madagascar throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly in the humid northeastern region around the towns of Antalaha and Sambava, an area growers still refer to today as the Vanilla Coast. The soil, the rainfall, and the tropical heat were close to ideal, and by the mid-20th century Madagascar had overtaken every rival. Today, depending on the year, Madagascar produces somewhere around 80% of the world's natural vanilla, almost all of it grown by smallholder farmers on tiny plots, hand-pollinated flower by flower during a narrow window each September, then hand-harvested, hand-sorted, and cured through weeks of sun-drying and sweating in wooden boxes wrapped in blankets, essentially an industrial-scale version of the exact process the Totonac invented for a jungle vine that, left to itself, tastes like nothing at all. The curing process alone takes months. Freshly picked green pods are first briefly blanched or killed in hot water to stop the plant tissue from continuing to grow. then wrapped in dark cloth and sweated in insulated boxes for days until they turn from green to a deep chocolate brown, then sun-dried on mats for weeks, then conditioned in sealed containers for several more months while their flavor compounds continue developing. From the day a flower is hand-pollinated to the day a finished bean is ready for market, close to a full year passes, and a newly planted vine will not even flower for the first time until it is 3 or 4 years old. That long, slow, entirely manual pipeline is the reason vanilla supply can never respond quickly to a spike in demand. You cannot simply plant more vines and fix a shortage next season. It takes years, and that mismatch, a slow-motion supply chain running headlong into a fast-moving global market, is exactly what set the stage for the chaos that was about to hit Madagascar. This concentration of the entire global supply into one relatively poor island, combined with a crop that takes years to mature and can be wiped out overnight by a single bad storm, created the conditions for exactly the kind of crisis that opened this video. In March 2017, Cyclone Enewo tore directly through Madagascar's main vanilla-growing region, destroying a significant share of that year's crop right as global demand for natural vanilla, driven partly by major food companies publicly pledging to drop artificial flavorings from their products, was climbing fast. Prices, which had sat around $50 a kilogram in the early 2010s, spiked to somewhere near $400 a kilogram by 2016 and 2017, briefly rivaling the price of silver by weight. For farming families who had spent generations growing vanilla for a modest living, a single sack of cured beans left drying on a porch was suddenly worth more than most of them earned in an entire year, which meant it was also suddenly worth stealing. Organized theft rings began raiding plantations at night, sometimes stripping vines of unripe pods weeks before harvest, ruining both the stolen crop and whatever the thief left behind. Farmers responded by arming themselves and standing guard over their own fields through the night, and desperate growers began clearing patches of protected rainforest, including land bordering national parks that are home to some of the last wild lemur populations on Earth, just to plant more vines while prices stayed high. Local communities, frustrated by a justice system too slow and too thin on the ground to keep up, increasingly took matters into their own hands. Suspected thieves caught in the act were, in case after case, beaten to death by the very communities they had targeted. By the height of the crisis, police and vigilante groups combined were apprehending more than 1,000 accused vanilla rustlers, and killings connected to vanilla theft were happening at a pace of roughly 5 per week. A flavoring best known for showing up in birthday cake had turned parts of rural Madagascar into something closer to a resource war. But if you think that boom lasted, here is the twist nobody saw coming. High prices did exactly what high prices always do. They convinced everyone to plant more. By 2019, so many farmers across Madagascar had rushed vanilla vines into the ground during the boom years that the harvest ballooned to roughly 1,500 tons, with projections running even higher for the following year, flooding a market that suddenly had far more vanilla than buyers wanted. Global demand, meanwhile, was softening. The result was one of the fastest price collapses the spice trade had seen in years. Farm gate prices for green, uncured vanilla in Madagascar fell by more than 70% in a single year, from around €40 a kilogram down to roughly 10. The Malagasy government tried to stop the bleeding by setting a mandatory minimum export price, first around $350 a kilogram for cured beans, then later lowered to $250 as exporters simply ignored the higher floor and kept undercutting each other anyway. Families who had built houses, bought motorbikes, and married off children on vanilla money during the boom were suddenly sitting on a crop worth a fraction of what it had been 3 years earlier. The same plant that had gotten people killed for a handful of beans was now barely worth the gasoline it took to drive them to market. Vanilla, it turns out, is not just the most labor-intensive spice in the world. It might also be one of the most volatile commodities on Earth, capable of swinging from silver-level prices to near worthlessness inside a single harvest cycle. While all of that boom-and-bust chaos was unfolding on one side of the vanilla story, an entirely different and far quieter revolution had already been playing out in European chemistry labs. And it explains why the vanilla flavor sitting in most people's kitchens right now has almost nothing to do with any of it. In 1874, two German chemists, Wilhelm Haarmans and Ferdinand Tiemann, worked out how to synthesize the primary flavor compound in vanilla, a molecule called vanillin, starting from coniferin, a substance found in pine bark. They patented the process that April, and shortly after, Haarmann partnered with a chemist named Carl Reimer to found a company that would manufacture the compound industrially, a business that, after mergers and rebranding over the following century, still exists today under the name Symrise. Just 2 years later, in 1876, Reimer worked out a second method of producing vanillin from a coal tar derivative called guaiacol, and in the following decades, chemists discovered that vanillin could also be extracted from lignin, the tough structural material inside wood that gets broken down as waste during industrial paper pulping. In other words, the paper industry was throwing away a chemical byproduct that happened to taste almost exactly like vanilla, and flavor companies started buying it up by the ton. Today, well over 99% of the vanilla flavor consumed around the world, in everything from ice cream to candles to shampoo, is not extracted from an orchid pod at all. It is synthetic vanillin, produced from petrochemical guaiacol, from paper mill waste, or, increasingly, from genetically engineered yeast and bacteria that ferment plain sugar into the exact same flavor molecule to satisfy food labeling rules that require a natural source without the price tag of an actual cured bean. Real vanilla extract, made from real cured orchid pods hand-pollinated on a hillside in Madagascar, has become a comparatively rare luxury ingredient, hiding behind a flavor that most of the planet now associates with cheap and ordinary. Not every vanilla story from this era is grim either. In 1789, the American statesman Thomas Jefferson returned home from a diplomatic posting in Paris, with his household chef freshly trained in French dessert techniques. And, among his personal papers, now held at the Library of Congress, is a handwritten recipe calling for cream, egg yolks, sugar, and, critically, a stick of vanilla folded into the custard before freezing it. Historians now believe the recipe actually originated with Jefferson's French butler rather than Jefferson himself, but it hardly matters. It is one of the very first written vanilla ice cream recipes in American history. Jefferson served the dish repeatedly at White House dinners, and in doing so, he helped plant the idea in the American imagination that vanilla was not just a background note in chocolate. It could be the entire point of a dessert on its own. Not every bean on the market even comes from the same plant either. What most of the world calls bourbon vanilla, the classic creamy, warm, slightly boozy aroma associated with Madagascar and Réunion, is Vanilla planifolia, the same species the Totonac originally domesticated. But there is a second commercially grown species, Vanilla tahitensis, cultivated mainly in French Polynesia, after French colonists carried cuttings there around the same era they were pushing vanilla into the Indian Ocean, prized by pastry chefs for a brighter, almost cherry and anise-like character instead of bourbon vanilla's deep, dark warmth. And Mexico, the country that started all of this, still grows small, increasingly prized quantities of the original variety, now marketed as a heritage product rather than a bulk commodity. In 2013, 5 of these island nations and territories, Madagascar, Réunion, Mauritius, The Comoros and the Seychelles even formed a joint tourism and trade alliance called the Vanilla Islands, explicitly branding an entire region of the Indian Ocean around the crop that Edmund Albius made possible there a century and a half earlier. Which brings us back to the word itself, because somewhere in the 20th century, vanilla stopped meaning just a flavor and started meaning an insult. By the mid-1900s, English speakers were using plain vanilla to describe the most basic, unadorned version of anything. A plain vanilla mortgage, a plain vanilla car, a plain vanilla personality, precisely because vanilla ice cream was the default flavor, the one you got if you didn't ask for anything more interesting. The word that once described a sacred Totonac ritual plant, an imperial Aztec tribute good, and a $400 a kilogram commodity people were being murdered over in Madagascar had, in ordinary conversation, become a synonym for having no personality at all, which is the strange, quiet joke sitting at the center of this entire story. Vanilla became the dictionary definition of plain precisely because 19th century chemists figured out how to fake its flavor cheaply enough to put it in absolutely everything. But the real thing behind that fake was never plain at all. It was a sacred plant fought over by two Mesoamerican empires. It was smuggled across an ocean tucked in beside chocolate. It stumped European science for 3 centuries until a 12-year-old enslaved boy solved in weeks what full-grown botanists could not solve in generations, then died poor while an entire industry got rich off his technique. It has swung, within a single decade, from a commodity worth killing over to one barely worth harvesting. And every time someone reaches for the plainest, most boring-sounding flavor on a supermarket shelf, they are, whether they know it or not, reaching for one of the strangest and most violent supply chains in the history of food. If this one surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of vanilla's history you didn't see coming. New episodes on the hidden histories behind everyday foodland every week, and you will not want to miss the next one.